Well, I've got to laugh because this next segment is going to be all about workaholism. And I've invited the Dean of Henley Business School, John Foster-Pedley, in studio to come and talk to me about this. I got the inspiration from a Harvard Business Review piece. And he's arrived with 2 phones. So I think here's a man who quite clearly knows all about working very hard. John, welcome to the show. 2 phones.
Yes, now I was really suspicious that you asked me to come along here tonight to talk about workaholism. Who have you been talking to? Yeah.
But I mean, it is, I'm reading a book by Charles Duhigg. He's a journalist over in the US, Pulitzer Prize winning author and journalist. And he's talking about productivity all throughout the book. And he references these characters that could be called or termed workaholics. 16 to 18 hour days, kind of always engaged, always on email, texting colleagues and sort of generally annoying everyone else around them. But we must be careful here. There's a big difference between working hard, as you were saying to me earlier, and being a workaholic.
I think that's really important because if you're an entrepreneur and you built your company and somebody phones you up after hours, you know this is really important to your money, your family, to building your business. So you've got a connection to the outcome that's around the business. And you're working hard for good reasons. And frankly, nothing was ever really built without hard work. And if we're going to build a good country, we are going to have to work smart and hard. There's a competitive world out there. But that's quite different from working to patch up your own because you get a compulsive need to do it or because you're somehow neurotically driven to it. Or it's a substitute for something important else in your life. So it's covering up. And I think that is what workaholism really is, although it's a very difficult boundary to find. So how do we actually, work effectively without slipping into that? How do we know we're losing the more important things in our life, for the sake of doing hard work and not covering up that loss, if you like, by saying, we've got to work hard because otherwise, the whole thing will collapse.
And very often it's about also understanding, if you're in a work office environment, the other person's pressures, putting yourself in your boss's shoes, for example. If you see him staying late every single day, is it, as you mentioned, is it because of company stress, because he needs to meet a deadline or needs to sign on a new client, or is there something else in their personal life that they're trying to fill up with work?
Yeah, and I think if you're working for a boss like that, him or her, who is clearly a workaholic, who's filling up their life with work, and is making this impassioned excuse for working hard because the company depends on it, and I've been working until 10 o'clock every night, and I have to do it. You've got to ask yourself the question, how good is that person at delegating? As a company grows, and you have a job, of course you take more and more on. But a good boss will be thinking ahead and saying, what are the systems I need to put in place to minimize that? How can I delegate? How can I get resources in place so that I'm always lifting myself above it? So somebody who's buried into workaholism is a nightmare to work for because they won't necessarily listen to your reasons. And there are 2 or 3 things you can do actually to defend yourself against somebody like that.
Well, what are those?
Well, one of the most useful tactics, and something that people often use on me, much to my irritation, but it really works, is to say, well, okay, so how do I prioritize this? I ask them to do something, and they say, well, how do I prioritize this? Do I let this go, or do I let that go? And it's a very effective technique because you've got to step back and say, oh yes, there's actually a limited pot here and I've got to make choices. And if you're asking somebody to do something without understanding the priorities yourself, you're not really doing your job as a boss. So what you need to do is understand priorities and ask them, could you do this and what would be the cost of this? What would be the priority? So ask your boss to help you with priorities. The second thing sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, so it's good to be task-oriented, but to understand which tasks are actually the most important. Yeah.
Well, that's another thing, because you can sit down with your boss and say, look, I really want to have a decent work-life balance here. I've got a young family, and I need to socialize, be with my friends. It helps me stay fresh on top of my job, helps me be effective and creative. How am I going to do that, boss? Can we have half an hour to do that? And say, now you co-opt your boss into planning that. The other thing that I tell MBA students a lot to avoid is perfectionism, because people see perfectionism as to their credit. But fundamentally, doing something like an MBA is you don't want to be perfectionist, surprisingly enough, because you've got to deliver a whole load of projects over time. And if you stop your delivery because you want to be an A+ student and it's going to take you double the hours. You actually stop the whole machine going forward. You've actually got to keep going. The thing about adult learning and real work is you can always go back to study. So perfectionism is a pathology, not a benefit. What you need to be is the concept of satisficing, doing a job well enough so it's really good. And if you have a factory with 30 machines in it, and one machine's working at a rate of 100 an hour and the rest are working at 20 an hour, that one machine's going to mess up the whole factory. All the stock's going to pile up. You have to optimize the system. You have to think systemically. And perfectionists don't.
And that is a remarkably simple observation, yet so clear in its in its articulation, John. The fact is, we're always trying to be the uber achievers, it seems, at work, and very often it delays our achieving anything. We don't get to that project on time or within budget because we're trying to tick off everything at the absolute best. How do we get away from that? Because I think there's a fear as an employee generally when you go up to your boss and say, well, I'm actually just trying to get everything done. It's not that I don't want to do it to the best of my ability, but these are the realities.
I think you've got to really go back to outcomes. If you can really think of what you're trying to do, you're trying to deliver great service, great products to people. And it's a complex system that you're trying to manage. A good boss manages a complex system. And I worked in Europe for a number of years, and I had a German boss. And I thought, oh, here we go. This is going to be all my stereotypes about perfectionist German boss. Actually, this guy, he worked probably 2/3 the hours the rest of us, and the thing worked well. What he knew how to do was delegate, was to set the priorities, was tell people what to do and take time out. And he came back fresh, and the system rolled forward. People weren't perfectionists. They understood the whole delivery system that the client would want, and that depends on everybody. So a perfectionist or a workaholic boss can be interesting in terms of the hard work, but can be very destructive to the organization. Avoid this at all costs.
John Foster-Pedley, Dean of Henley Business School, with some really sage advice for working with workaholic bosses here on Classic Business.